It's always a funny thing to follow the university president. On the one hand, the bar is very, very high. On the other hand, people are slightly less interested in what I have to say, so then the pressure is off. But thank you. I'm kidding. Thank you also to Sherilyn and the folks who organized this event, which, as has been mentioned, feels necessary even in this moment when I think that we are all emotionally and intellectually quite tired. I know that I am. I've been tasked with giving the historian's take on how we got here. And I'm going to start somewhere that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have anticipated, right? I'm going to give the historian's take, and yet I'm going to start us only 15 years ago, which there are some of my colleagues would argue is not quite yet history. I happen to think that history is a method, not a time period, but that's a conversation for a different day. For me, emotionally and perhaps analytically, the route to how we got here lies through New Orleans. If you recall, 15 years ago in August 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. The storm and ensuing flood killing 1,800 people, about 970 of them from Louisiana, and displaced thousands upon thousands more. In New Orleans, the population dropped from roughly 485,000 folks in 2000 to 230,000 by July 2006. Those numbers have gone back up, but not to their pre-Katrina numbers. African Americans were the hardest hit among them. When I think of Katrina these 15 years later, I think of a few things. I think of Barbara Bush, wife of one president and mother of another, commenting while touring the Astrodome, which was in effect a refugee camp, that what I'm hearing, which is sort of scary, is that they all want to stay in Houston. The folks in the Astrodome, she said, were underprivileged anyway. So this is working very well for them. I think too of the families on the New Orleans Danziger Bridge who were walking across the bridge to go get medical supplies, some of them, a different family walking back home after they had stayed behind to rescue their animals, when they were fired upon by police, and that firing upon then subsequently completely covered up. I never thought I'd be shot, one woman whose arm was blown off told a reporter 6 months afterwards. And I never thought I'd be shot by the police. I thought the police were there to protect and to serve. And then finally, when I think of Hurricane Katrina, I recall that I have stopped screening Spike Lee's documentary about Katrina when the levees broke in class, because I cannot watch Terrence Blanchard bring his mother back to her ruined home in the Ninth Ward without starting to cry in front of my students. Asked by a New York Times reporter just a few weeks after Katrina how Hurricane Katrina had altered our view of race in this country, the historian John Hope Franklin responded, "The tragedy is that Hurricane Katrina changed our view at all. We should have known the things that Katrina brought out." I'm with John Hope Franklin on this, as I am on so many things. We should have known the things that Katrina brought out. We should have known the things that COVID-19 has brought out. We should have known the things that the murders of Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd brought out. And I say we, but let's be honest. I actually mean you. I mean the not African Americans sort of audience in this conversation. Most Black folks already knew these things. We didn't need to know. We needed to be believed. And we needed folks to care enough to change American politics. So questioning how did we get here runs me through New Orleans, because Katrina was a crystalline moment for me when what I knew intellectually as an historian collided with what I felt achingly as a Black American. That, in the aggregate, in the United States, Black lives counted for less, were valued less, and that Black citizenship remained conditional. So how are we here, we ask? The short answer is we're here because American politicians and policymakers and much of the American public tend to treat the race problem in America, which is sort of the old-fashioned way that people used to talk about it, as if it were a problem with Black people, rather than a problem with the country's commitment to racialized power, right? In historian speak, we would talk about this as a sort of matter of white supremacy as a system of political economy with an ideological argument embedded, and of settler colonialism with it, which is both a set of actions and an assertion of white racial destiny, right? Those two things together have sort of produced and shaped the history of the United States as it has unfolded. This is the concise answer, right? But it doesn't tell you as much as we probably need to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a longer answer. And I'm going to do it through histories that I've discussed before. I'll talk to you about some of my writing, but I want us to be clear on a few things as the kind of underlying sort of foundations that structure the rest of what I'm saying. The first thing that I want to talk about is what historians call the Morgan thesis. This is taking an idea that the great historian Edmund Morgan developed in thinking about colonial Virginia. And this thesis is almost as old as I am at this point, which is increasingly older than most historical ideas that continue to have traction. But it has lasting power because it's compelling, because it's a good argument. And what Edmund Morgan wrote in his classic book, American Slavery, American Freedom, is that the expansion of freedoms for Americans of European descent was rooted in the locating of unfreedom in the bodies of people of African descent. This is an intellectual history argument. It's also an argument about sort of racialization and racial formation. What he tells us is that in England in the 17th century, the English had come to view the poor as almost an alien race, but that it reminded tremendous amounts of work, arguments of philosophers, treatises, tracts, making people wear badges, all sorts of things, to mark them as separate and other, and to argue this point. In the hot mess that was colonial Virginia, on the other hand, it wasn't necessary to prove that the enslaved were a different race because they were. And as the number of poor whites diminished as slavery increased, what Morgan calls the viscous traits of character attributed by Englishmen to their poor could in Virginia increasingly appear to be the exclusive heritage of Black people. Once inequality was racialized, then more white men could be free. The usefulness of thinking about colonial Virginia in this context is that it links the history of racial slavery and again, the history of settler colonialism. To go back to what I said before, these systems of political economy with these narratives of white racial destiny. And it also reminds us that the racialization of Afro-descended people as Black and the linking of that to perpetual lessness is also bound up in the same unfolding history of Native Americans as deserving to be displaced or would you say, of their impending doom, right? A narrative that remains in place and intractable even as Native American communities are all around us, right? So seeing those intertwined histories, I think, is also important for the stories of incarceration, of policing, and of COVID vulnerability that we are trafficking in today. So if that's the Morgan thesis, right, that's the pre-emancipation story. The other part of this is also a story about the vexing dilemma of Black citizenship, because from post-emancipation onward, if the linking of unfreedom with Blackness allowed for the conception of freedom with whiteness, what then does emancipation do, right? African Americans come in understanding citizenship as what they want, with beautiful, amazing, powerful, liberatory visions of what freedom and citizenship might mean. white Americans are anxious, worried both about controlling African American labor, but also controlling the idea of African Americans, right? So the ongoing resistance, not just to Black aspiration, but to Black success, right? The story of Reconstruction is of African Americans helping to build this really powerful and amazing democracy, and folks coming in and swooping and dismantling it, right? The story of Jim Crow is not about things just having stayed in a lull, but African Americans building connection and solidarity with some white Americans who had similar class or economic concerns, but that very solidarity was itself dangerous, right? And the undoing of these things, the attacks on Black citizenship, the resistance to reimagining what American democracy might be and whom it might encompass, was a project that was always wrapped up in larger histories of discipline, surveillance, policing, and anti-Black violence, either collective and vigilante or practiced through institutions like the police. So we have the Morgan thesis, the vexing dilemma of Black American citizenship as the things that structure this. But I also want to talk a little bit about the idea, and this is the third part, is that progress is not guaranteed, nor is it perpetual. It might not even be likely, right? So I'm giving this keynote as a scholar of African American history, right? I majored in history, got a PhD in history. I am now a historian. It's my bag, it's my thing. I really like it, and I find it both intellectually and emotionally useful for helping me understand the world. I will say, and I think that all undergraduates should do this, I took a side detour into a random one semester major as a Russian and Slavic studies major. I don't think everyone should be a Russian major. I think everybody should do a confusing and unexpected thing. But what spending a semester with 19th century Russian literature did for me was to immerse myself in a time and a society in which people did not necessarily expect better things to come, and in which leaders did not demand of the people that they dominated, right, subjugated, the fiction that the leaders themselves were good. Just seeing that difference, and seeing this like rich and beautiful and darkly hilarious like cultural production come out of that, also had a value to me when I returned to American history to think about the particulars of a sort of American understanding of things. What I think that our insistence on progress, our need for our own goodness does actually, is to produce a certain complacency, right? That a struggle has been fought and it doesn't need to be fought again. And it also absolves people of their responsibility for the ways in which they benefit from or actually participate in reproducing systems that perpetuate the inequities of the past. What it does, or what it doesn't account for, this myth of progress, as historian Glenda Gilmore would say, is the protean nature of white supremacy. We love the story of the Black freedom struggle. I love the story of the Black freedom struggle. It is sustaining. But what it doesn't do is get us to an understanding of how white supremacy is, again, a system of political economy, a system of racialized power, continues to like contest and try to grab back resources from African Americans, tries to undo the success of the Black freedom struggle. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I am going to tell you quickly about one woman's experience with state violence and with police violence as a way to make a little bit concrete some of the things that I am talking about. And then I will close us out. There are a number of cases that I could talk about. There's a number of places, a number of time periods that I could go to, but this one has been on my mind a lot for a variety of reasons, and that is the story of Henrietta Wright in Winona, Mississippi, who went to register to vote in August of 1965, just weeks after the Voting Rights Act had been passed. Henrietta Wright was a Black woman, small business owner, owned a cafe on the end of town. She embedded in the warp and woof of Winona life. She was driving back from having put her name on the voter rolls when she was pulled over by a deputy from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department who followed her home, actually, pulled her over in her front yard and told her that he was going to arrest her for running a stop sign. She basically said, I didn't run a stop sign, figured that her husband would settle it, went inside to go about her business when that deputy plus a number of other policemen came up to her, dragged her out at the point of a shotgun and beat her on the lawn in front of her business establishment. They took her back to the Montgomery County Jail where they beat her some more. And then when she asked for a doctor, they laughed at her. The next morning, they kept her overnight. The next morning, beat her some more. So she had wounds when she told the story years later, knots, blood clots, sort of damage to her teeth, all that were left over from this beating. But in this moment, they told her, Henrietta, you're crazy if you think you're going to vote. Then they called in a local doctor and had her declared mentally unfit and then shipped her down to the state mental health facility in Whitfield, Mississippi, where she was then kept for 10 weeks before she was released. We know the story because she got in touch with civil rights lawyers and sued the Winona County Sheriff's Department and sued the doctor who admitted her. She didn't win, right? But she at least stood in front of a court of law and said, this happened to me and it is not right. In some ways, you tell the story and people think, oh, well, it's Mississippi, right? And everybody knows that Mississippi is a problem. But Mississippi is America, right? It might be America in the extreme in the 1960s, but Mississippi is America. And the vicious as the violence in Montgomery County Jail may have been, it was neither arbitrary nor was it isolated. White supremacists had been deploying violence, and in Henrietta Wright's case, in the way that they sort of assaulted her and grabbed hold of her, sexualized violence as a weapon of terror aimed at the entire Black community. And they intended for that violence to break both bodies and spirits. Assaults and ritualized humiliation had often accompanied assaults on African American freedom struggles, and they were meant to establish the body as the terrain for fighting out deeply political questions of domination and subordination, authority, and autonomy. In the wake of the post-Civil War Memphis riot of 1866, for example, white policemen and rioters repeatedly invaded African American homes and assaulted freed women, a demonstration that freedom hadn't given Black folks the ability to defend themselves or each other. This continued. It continued over decades. In my first book, Freedom Struggles, African Americans in World War I tell a story of deputies in outside of Dallas, Texas, who were grabbing Black school teachers off the street and taking them to the edges of town and assaulting them. This in the midst of World War I. A local African American who challenged bystanders to go and help the kidnapped women said, if you don't have guts enough to fight, you don't need no democracy. Similarly, this happened in other places. In Monroe, North Carolina, Robert F. Williams, who would come to be known as a sort of articulator of the ideas of armed self-defense, recalls as a child seeing Big Jesse Helms, so Jesse Helms' father, who was a policeman, dragging a Black woman off to jail. Her dress, Williams writes, up over her head the same way a caveman would club and drag his sexual prey. White onlookers stood around laughing at the hollering woman, while Black onlookers scurried off in shame. So in the 1950s, when Williams was counterposing Martin Luther King and the viability of nonviolence, he would point to this cruelly bizarre sight as formative. They were formative for a number of other people, right? They seared themselves in African American memory. Segregationists meant for these scenes to demonstrate the continuation of white patriarchal power, to make Black men and women see themselves as dishonored and debased, and to frighten African Americans into focusing on their labor responsibilities rather than their citizenship rights. As with the assault on Henrietta Wright, this narrative violence was often accompanied and sustained bodily violence. When discussing lynching, assaults, and rape, white authorities made a discursive feint, redirecting the public conversation towards Black on white sexual violence. So in both word and deed, they served as performances of white men's mastery and powerlessness over African Americans. And yet we know, and we have seen recently, that narrative and performance can do much work at once, not always affecting the audience as intended. African Americans often took different lessons from fraught encounters about the nature and tactics of resistance, who they were as people, and about the burning need for change. Indeed, the very stridency and frequency of white demonstrations of violence during the 1960s signaled that many segregationists feared that political dominance didn't secure their hold on power. The Black freedom struggle continually threatened white supremacist notions of place and power, and the struggle's evolution into a mass social movement with fledgling federal support made the threat all the more immediate and intense. The attack on Henrietta Wright was an attack on Black voting, and an attack on Black voting was an attack on Black political power. It was a sign of the sheriff's power on the one hand, but it was also a sign of his fear. What interested me when I read her case with Sandra Bland's sort of death on my mind was the move to relabel Wright as insane, right? In order to invalidate her. It wasn't new exactly, but it felt like the future. It felt like it signaled the ways in which the discourses of lawlessness, the intensifying narratives of Blackness or sort of joining Blackness and criminality would come to justify the excesses of police practice, right? That at some point, the language of Blackness might fall out, but the practices of Jim Crow would be so deeply embedded in law and order policing that some of the effect would be the same. We see this in books, right? The sort of Elizabeth Hinton's From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime actually shows us how this is a practice is not the sort of the lone purview of Republicans seeking to find the sort of angry, displaced Southern Democrats who are angry about the move to embracing civil rights legislation, but that it's actually part of the way that Americans began to think about law and order and Black criminality more broadly speaking. Reading about or rereading the Wright story for this talk also reminded me, or I was struck too by a quote from the Saturday Evening Post, rebelling against or sort of recoiling from the more visceral expressions of Black trauma and disaffection that came with uprisings in places like Newark or Philadelphia or Los Angeles. What the Post said in 1966 was that they had grown weary of African Americans' howling need for the schools, jobs, housing, and all the other minimum rights of the American system. Having grown tired of them, they said to their readers, "Let us face it, we are all Mississippians." I'm going to make a quick pivot in closing that is going to feel like it is a digression, but it's actually not. And I'm going to say that I have watched a lot of Saturday Night Live over my 46 years. And I watched a lot of it in the last few years. And I was particularly taken with or intrigued by, from like 2016 to whatever that was, 2018, their depiction of former Alabama Senator turned Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was played by comedian Kate McKinnon. Um, there's one episode in particular when Kate McKinnon as Jeff Sessions emerges from a cabinet in Mike Pence's office to have a tete-a-tete with then senatorial candidate Roy Moore. The big laugh for most people is when McKinnon as Sessions tells Moore that the former judge is too Bama even for him, and then tells him to go get out and let him get back to his gerrymandering. But when I really sat up was when Jeff Sessions cuddles up with a possum he pulls from the medicine cabinet and says, "Papa, I need some advice." The conceit that Jeff Sessions is half possum was a throwaway absurdity, but it stuck in my mind. And it stuck in my mind for this reason, because one could make the case that Jeff Sessions is indeed a possum. His appointment as Attorney General serves as a reminder that the Dixiecrats never died off. They just sat in place, bloated and gaseous, till the threat of federal intervention receded. A younger Jeff Sessions had worked to carry segregation into the post-1960s era. As Coretta Scott King wrote, and Elizabeth Warren reminded us, Sessions, quote, used the awesome power of his position as U.S. Attorney to chill the free exercise of the vote by Black citizens in Alabama, combining politically motivated voting fraud prosecutions, going after civil rights activists in rural Alabama, with an indifference towards criminal violations of civil rights laws. Coretta Scott King warned that a federal judgeship would further empower Sessions to accomplish through law what local sheriffs had accomplished with clubs and cattle prods. Although the Senate Judiciary Committee denied Sessions the appointment in a vote of 10-8, he and his compatriots won the long game. In his position as Attorney General, he not only gave cover for opponents of voting rights, he legitimated the use of the cattle and prod and club in the name of law and order. In other words, Sessions, as legal scholar David Cole wrote in the New York Review of Books, dramatically transformed the Justice Department, effectively causing it to renege on its historic mission of defending civil rights. Although one could question how historic or longstanding the DOJ's investment in civil rights had been, it's nonetheless true that it's been consequential. And Sessions' deliberate steering the Justice Department back towards J. Edgar Hoover levels of hostility towards people of colors and countless others, coupled with the knowledge, born of decades in the Senate, of how to embed and entrench revanchism in the federal bureaucracy, is consequential too. It will have long-standing consequences for how citizenship works and for whom it works, and whether domestically we even get to act on human rights claims wrapped up in the armor of citizenship. Possum though Jeff Sessions may be, there is nothing funny about him. And this is not the story of one man or even one half man, half possum. It took a lot to get Sessions to a place where he could institutionalize grave damage. Folks in the Reagan administration had to look at his legacy of targeting civil rights groups and say, that's the judge we need. Then Attorney General Edwin Meese had to deride principal objections to Sessions' racism as vicious personal attacks of groups with ideological axes to grind. It took voters in Alabama electing him to the Senate and his colleagues there painting anti-racism as bad manners, thus paving the way for his later confirmation, in which Elizabeth Warren's identifying Sessions as a racist was far worse than his actually being one. In other words, it took a lot of effort and investment, and that work began long ago. And there's nothing new about a heartfelt embrace of old-fashioned white supremacy coupled in the discourse of law and order, of course. I've told you about Henrietta Wright. I could have told you in a talk about Sagon Penn, beaten by 3 San Diego policemen in 1985. Penn disarmed his antagonist and shot him with his own gun. He wasn't convicted ultimately because the police officer was so racist that the jury deemed it self-defense. He'd been training with paramilitary organizations in the desert. I can't imagine any similar court case playing out that way now, in part because of the way that Penn's case played out then. Outrage over his acquittal didn't spawn a reconsideration of policing practices in minority neighborhoods. It spawned a howling protest against taking racism seriously. It spawned Black Lives Matter. Not surprisingly, Sessions as Attorney General neither started any investigations of police abuse nor displayed much inclination to issue consent decrees to cities showing systemic abuse in policing, nor, in fact, to honor ones already extant. He wasn't just reviving broken windows policing, he was throwing in some broken bodies to boot. This kind of hostility to justice has far-reaching effects. As Tressie McMillan Cotton said after Black men were arrested for being in a Philadelphia Starbucks, in a broken windows approach to policing, being Black is the broken window. It is just cause for aggressive policing. She adds, in this respect, the Philadelphia Police Commissioner wasn't wrong when he said the officers did their job. They did, and that's the problem. To close, I am going to go back to citing John Hope Franklin, or actually citing Bill Clinton's discussion of John Hope Franklin, for those of you who remember his memorial service here at Duke, where where Clinton described John Hope Franklin as an angry, happy man, or a happy, angry man. That combination, the angriness and the happiness, is a combo of knowing your worth in spite of what the world tells you, but it's also the perspective of knowing all sorts of things while watching other people not know. For Franklin, a child during the Tulsa riot and an old man during Katrina, it was watching how people's collective forgetting gave them a means to absolve themselves of responsibility. When the New York Times reporter asked Franklin about his 137 honorary degrees, he replied, "Some of it's conscience pay. I don't want to belabor the point, but giving out awards makes the givers feel good. It's easier to give me an honorary degree than to make certain that all Blacks have a decent place to live." Our task for now and for going forward is to make sure that our expressions of concern, of willingness to listen, of regret for what's come before are more than just conscience pay. That's our responsibility as members of the Duke community. It's our responsibility as members of the American nation. It's a responsibility of citizens in the world. With that, I will hush and turn the mic over to Jay Pearson. Thank you all.